My buddy Drakkar, who logs into ESO once or twice a month to PvP and then mulls so hard from the experience that he quits playing for a couple of weeks, managed to pull off a pretty impressive flip the other day. He bought a silken ring motif for 3k gold and resold it for 100k. I personally think he could have gotten away with selling it for even higher than that, but for someone who's PvP brained, that's a pretty impressive trading moment. I'll give him that. Him gloating about his epic flip on Discord inspired me to make this video, because it definitely highlights something that I think a lot of traders have been ignoring as of late. You can skip ahead to where I go right into discussing this notion if you don't really give a damn about the theory behind why this is the case by using the timestamps. Otherwise, I would like to briefly touch on this ESO market theory because I'm a cringer that finds this kind of shit fascinating. Okay, so you know that one meme where it's like, what's your opinion on blank that will result in this? Yeah, well, I feel like what I'm about to say is gonna be one of those moments. Please be nice to me. Now, granted, I've only been playing ESO for a little over 4 years now, so take what I have to say with a grain of salt, but I feel as if the general skill level of the average ESO player has definitely diminished over the years. Please don't bully me. I'm not trying to be abrasive, I promise. This isn't some elaborate skill issue bit. I was watching some PvP streamer shit and piss over the state of ESO a while back. You know how they are. And when talking about the direction of the game, they asked, rhetorically, who even is the average ESO player these days? Admittedly, it is something I've occasionally thought about ever since then. When I take a moment to remember my PvE and PvP experiences from even just a couple of years ago, and I'm reminded of the kinds of allies and enemies that I fought with and against on the battlefield, or the pickup groups that I'd get grouped up with for Undaunted pledges, and then compare those experiences with the ones that I've had in recent times, there's definitely a difference. Just to throw out a few examples, I've noticed that players in PvP these days are far more likely to stick to playing with ball groups, massive zergs, or faction stacks even, than they are to play alone or in small groups. And this can definitely hinder their individual PvP capabilities when they're put in fair fight scenarios. In PvE, I've noticed that a lot of pugs have a harder time with mechanics, and they don't do a lot of damage, despite game development decisions really catering to more casual-friendly DPS rotations and builds in recent times. These days, it's fairly common to do 90% of the DPS when completing Undaunted pledges with pugs, something that wasn't quite as common years ago. Not to mention the fact that the endgame player bases for both PvE and PvP have been dwindling. If you don't want to take my word for it, a lot of content creators that specialize in these areas of the game or lead corresponding PvE and PvP communities will tell you the same thing. Some even came ready with the receipts to further prove it to you. I mean, I'm a Battlegrounds main, and the argument that the PvP community as a whole is hemorrhaging players is absolutely undeniable. Straight facts, on God. For real, for real. But of course, this opinion of mine has formed based on my own accounts and experiences. Have you noticed any differences? I've had some chats with a few peeps that have also played the game for a while now, and they've come to similar conclusions when comparing the player base then with the player base now. Many of these gamers believe that this shift in the average player's skill level is a direct result of the lack of player retention that the game has, meaning a lot of players simply don't play long enough to ever truly become experts in PvE and PvP before they've lost interest in the game, as well as the direction that the game has taken over the past few years, one that caters more to the casual player as opposed to the hardcore one. Skill levels aside, I think it's plausible to argue that this shift in ESO's direction has also welcomed a shift in the mentality or outlook of the average player when it comes to actually playing ESO. Instead of logging in to chase endgame dungeon and trial achievements or test one's strength and metal in Battlegrounds, IC, and Cyrodiil, because let's face it, what else was there to really work towards back then? An increasing amount of ESO players these days are perfectly happy spending their time in Tamriel partaking in more casual activities, such as scrying and digging for antiquities, questing with their companions, and playing some chill games of Tales of Tribute with friends or NPCs. These latter three examples were not even possible gameplay options when I first started playing ESO years ago, and the former gameplay options have not received a ton of fresh content and rewards over the years. We can truly say that the average ESO player these days is built different, because they really are. They are familiarizing themselves with a game that is incredibly different than the game that veteran players of the franchise came to know when they were first introduced to it. So it makes perfect sense that our preferences when it comes to playing the game are more likely to be substantially different. And hey, just for the record, I'm not judging how any of you want to play the game. I'm a casual in my own right, okay? I spend a fair amount of time trying to earn virtual currency when I play ESO, so I'm absolutely not in a position to judge. To each their own. So why am I mentioning all this stuff? I thought this was supposed to be a gold guide. It is, but I think it's important to really understand this concept of the more casual-leaning direction that ESO has taken over the years, and how that has affected the player base. If you're interested in spotting great gold-making opportunities in this game, it'll do you well to consider how a more casual player base may impact the player economy. If more players are less interested in participating in more objectively difficult content, or if they lack the skill to complete this content entirely and have no interest in changing this reality, or maybe they just can't find enough like-minded people to play with to partake in this content, it's fair to presume that any rewards associated with this kind of difficult content should become more valuable as they are less frequently attained. On PCNA, we've been able to observe that the supply for many of these kinds of items has definitely decreased, which of course only promotes the increase of their prices. While I am only focusing on one concept in this video, there definitely are and will continue to be many more financially savvy opportunities to come in the future should this trend persist. Think about the kinds of items whose supply will suffer as fewer players strive to complete the content that rewards them. In this video, I'm going to touch on one of the most prominent examples of a portion of the ESO market that has experienced some significant changes in light of this shift in the average player's skill and interests when playing the game, and that's the motif market. I'm going to focus on specifically the motifs that you can earn from DLC dungeons and trials. Okay, take a shot anytime I say dungeon in this next paragraph if you're looking to speedrun any % liver failure. Motifs have a chance to drop from DLC dungeons. The motifs that drop upon completing a dungeon are specific to that dungeon, and they are the same kinds of motifs seen on the mobs in the dungeon. There's a 10% chance that motifs will drop from completing a DLC dungeon on the normal difficulty, a 50% chance if you complete the DLC dungeon on the veteran difficulty, and a 100% chance upon completing the dungeon's hard mode. Dungeon. In recent times, DLC dungeon and trial motifs on PCNA have experienced a significant increase in their value. Back in my day, a lot of dungeon and trial motifs used to sell for like, what, 8K a pop? And some people still list them for this much. Now, of course, the value of all things has gone up in light of inflation, but the value of motifs has increased disproportionately, seeing as their supply has substantially decreased and their demand is still ever present because, say it with me folks, fashion is endgame. Oftentimes, if you take a peek at a DLC dungeon motif on TTC to either get an idea of what others are listing it for or to see where you can buy one for yourself, you may notice that there are hardly any other instances of it being listed on the market. Granted, there are so many more dungeons to run these days, so it would make sense that there'd be less of one particular dungeon motif available on the market, but the decreased interest that the player population has concerning running vet dungeons really amplifies this. For example, at the time of recording, there isn't a singular Dreadhorn helmet motif available on the entire PCNA market. You know those will sell for a small fortune. When the supply for a particular sought-after item in the game is near non-existent, and there's hardly any competition among sellers, this can allow players to charge significantly more for that particular item and still receive a sale. So two things should come to mind upon hearing this concerning DLC dungeon and trial motifs. 1. Players that partake in these activities regularly should be getting better financially compensated for their time spent playing the game now, when they go ahead and sell the motifs that they earned from their endgame pursuits. And 2. This makes motifs prime candidates for all of the degenerate item flippers out there looking to make a quick buck by buying out all of one particular motif in the game and relisting it for significantly more than they bought it for. Not that I would know anything about doing that. On the topic of flipping, I want to point out that a lot of endgamers tend to underprice their motifs. I think a lot of them are not aware of the fact that they can get so much more gold from them. I could certainly see why these players would not be too concerned over min-maxing the prices of their motifs when they get them all the time from running content and they're just looking to make a quick sale. But maybe don't underprice your motifs too much, eh? I know y'all still need gold to buy those heroism pots and whatnot. I don't know, man. If you have a solid trader, you should try to get your money's worth. Or someone else will, when they buy your motifs and flip them for profit. The silken ring motif that Drakkar swiped for 3k and resold for 100k came from a guild with a lot of dungeon and trial runners. In fact, I've been swiping cheap motifs from this guild for years, but my point is that I really highly recommend checking the Tamriel Trade Center website to see not just what other players are listing their motifs for, but most importantly, how many instances of that particular item are available on the market. If you see that there are hardly any available, let this sway your decision-making process when it comes to determining a price. Price it really high, go all out, man. If you don't, you'll likely just get flipped by some trading enjoyer. Checking TTC also allows you to spot if any players are attempting to hold a monopoly for specific motifs. When this is the case, those players often price their motifs for ridiculous prices, and you can take advantage of this by listing your identical wares slightly below their prices. It may seem absurd to you, and it may go against what your trading add-ons recommend, but remember, in this instance, if an interested buyer is looking for that particular motif, they'll have no choice but to buy your listing, as your listing will still be cheaper than the listings made by the individual that has a monopoly on the motif in question. I think the number one culprit behind why so many endgamers list their motifs for incredibly low amounts of gold is because they rely too heavily on their trading add-ons for guidance. Be mindful of the fact that some of these add-ons pull data from the guilds that you're in, and if you're in guilds that have trading stalls in less than ideal locations, or if there are a lot of undercutters in your guild, which is usually the case with guilds that aren't trading guilds first and foremost, this can heavily sway your data. It will suggest that you ought to list your item for much lower than it can really sell for. Be sure to use add-on functions to blacklist guilds like these to help remove these outliers. A lot of trading add-ons also provide you with information regarding sales made in the past, and while this is important stuff to know, it's only half of the picture. It's also important to look to the future by way of checking the TTC website or scouring traders yourselves if you're on console to take a look at the direction that an item's price is taking. Once again, this can be determined by looking at the prices of current listings and the number of total listings. So, what should you be taking away from all this? Well, first of all, I think you should really consider checking out more endgame content if you haven't already, and if you want to, of course. We really need more people in those BG queues, and in Cyrodiil, and IC, and in dungeon queues. And if you're already doing these things but find that you're strapped for cash, then you're likely not listing your items for reasonable amounts, especially considering the decline of their supply over the years. I hope I've been able to shed some light on the gold-making potential of earning or flipping DLC dungeon and trial motifs. I also hope that, from my ramblings, you've been able to take something away to better help you determine a price for your motifs so that you can get the most out of your time spent earning them. I only talked about motifs in this video, but it's interesting to consider the other items or services that have experienced similar value increases for similar reasons, like items associated with the PvP currency Telvar going up in value because hardly anyone ventures into the Imperial City these days, or the price of carries skyrocketing because there aren't as many carry guilds and services out there to compete with one another for prices. And the demand for carries warrants the price. I mean, shit, people are willing to pay millions to buy several normal dungeon carries for gear, man. That shit is... I could have never fathomed this years ago. Although endgame PvEers and PvPers may not be receiving new, spicy rewards as often as they used to in the past, willing to buy more earnable cosmetics, a silver lining now is that the items that can be accrued through completing challenging PvE and PvP tasks can sell for more than you might think in light of the changing player base. Be mindful of this when listing your wares, don't become too reliant on your trading add-ons, and get properly compensated compensated for the time that you've spent becoming proficient in this game. You've earned it. That's all for now, gamers. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk about a dead game. That was a joke, toxic casuals. You can sit back down in your seats. Thank you to my YouTube members for allowing me to actually have this content creation side gig, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.